the idea of inclusive diets within planetary boundaries. I feel I'm a bit of the host speaker that's going to present some of the more global, broad-ranging trends that we're seeing with food systems, along with diets and climate change. But there's some incredible experts who will be speaking in greater detail about their work and their contributions to this very vexing space. It's a really interesting time to be having this conference too, because of the COP27 that's going on now, with food very high on the agenda at the COP27 meeting. Let's hope it makes it to the negotiating table. But today I'll talk about a little bit of a history of sustainable diets, why we need to transform food systems, this call for grand transformation, the intersection of climate and diets, some of the ethical conundrums and trade-offs that cloud food system transformation, and how do we get towards ensuring inclusive diets within planetary boundaries. So just to start us off, we're not starting from scratch. There's been a long history of how do we move towards more healthy and sustainable diets. If we look back even just 55 years ago in the United States, there was a significant environmental movement, a significant food movement underway with the countercultures, the hippies, as they are called in the United States. But this was born out of a growing concern about planetary constraints, population constraints. We had Rachel Carson's Silent Spring talking about the implications of DDT. We had Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, very controversial, a book when we look back now, knowing what we know about colonization and some of the other implications of that. The Limits of Growth, Club of Rome's manuscript that created a lot of controversy, but got people thinking about what are the planetary constraints. And of course, the whole environmental movement was born out of this era, with the first Earth Day being 1970, we're talking 50 plus years ago, and the opening of the UN Environmental Program in Kenya in 1972. At the same time, there was concerns about how our food was being produced. We had a ton of different publications. We had the Back to the Lander movements, Francis Moore Lepay's Diet for a Small Planet, which is basically Eat Lancet #1, really showed the growing concern of how our food was being produced and processed and industrialized. And of course, those movements shaped those times, but they still shape our times. The idea of food co-ops, now what we think of as Whole Foods. The Black Panthers started the breakfast school program to feed children, to ensure they didn't go to school hungry. The ways of organic agriculture. This was all born, 50 plus years ago. So we have a lot of history behind us that we need to remember and learn from. So why do we need a grand food system transformation? Why is it so critical now? Well, first, to start us off, what does it mean to transform food systems? And there's a lot of lofty goals that you'll see here: ensuring availability, access, and affordability of sufficient, nutritious, safe diets for everyone, ensuring those foods are produced from sustainable and resilient food systems, that they're promoting fair and equitable livelihoods and wages, and that they benefit nature. But when you ask people what they think of when they think of food system transformation, they'll say many things: community, reciprocity, justice, cooperation, hospitality, racial equity. So people have different interpretations of food system transformation, but we want to achieve it all. The question is, can we do that? And this is a depiction, a framework of food systems. You can see there's many components of food systems here in the central piece, from food supply chains, food environments, the place where people shop or order food. People are involved in that, and they have their own individual factors and behaviors. And of course, we want all of these outcomes here on the right of food systems: economic, nutrition and health, environment, social equity outcomes. And these are influenced by many drivers, these different components. Drivers, some outside the food system, that are shaping food systems in different ways, both positively and negatively. This is a very abstract view of food systems. There's many interactions happening across these components and many actors, from small to transnational actors. This transformation of this type of system that involves so many components and actors is incredibly challenging. So one of the reasons why we need to transform our food system is because if we want to reach the Paris climate change targets, which is pretty much off the table, we won't get to 1.5, it's pretty clear, we need to take multiple food system actions. Here shown in yellow is we need to improve food production, improving efficiency, increasing yield, but that won't get us to getting towards 1.5. This line below shows you a 67% chance of staying below 1.5. The green are diets, improving the portion sizes and more plant dominant diets that will get us closer to 1.5, but not enough. Reducing food loss and waste will get us somewhat there, but not enough. The key is this last bar. We need to do all of these things and do them well if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. We also know that we need to transform food systems because inequities are deepening and plaguing progress. This is work that was published in the SOPHI report in 2020 and moving forward, and work by Anna Herforth and Will Masters and colleagues. It's fantastic work that they've been doing over the last few years, and you'll hear from Anna Herforth later today. And this is showing the percentage of the population who cannot afford a healthy diet, with that darker color being upwards of 50 to 75% of the population can't afford a healthy diet. And FAO reports that about 3 billion people cannot afford what is considered a healthy diet. That is an incredible statistic, and you can bet that that would worsen over the next years as we see the impacts of climate, COVID, and conflict. We also know that the types of foods available are not optimal for human health. We see this increased sales of what are called ultra-processed foods. These are foods that are high in sugar, salts, and fats. There's a breadth of evidence building of their impacts on human health, weight, variety of health outcomes that I'm sure someone will discuss in some detail today. But we see the sales of these foods rising in almost every region and projecting out to 2024. And this is work by Phil Baker and colleagues at Deakin. And this is alarming to see these trends, but not so surprising. These foods are cheap, they are convenient, and they're tasty. So this is the drive that we see on the demand side. We need to also transform food systems because this inability to access and afford healthy diets, the kinds of diets people are consuming, is contributing to the malnutrition burden. We still have a huge number of people who go to bed hungry, 828 million right now and increasing. We still have an unfinished agenda with many children who are undernourished, be it chronically, known as stunting, or acutely, known as wasting, and 2.2 billion people overweight or obese, which is a measure of body mass index, not a great measurement and under a lot of scrutiny these days. A lot of these figures are starting to not go in the right direction if they were going in the right direction. And we're seeing now a significant crisis of 205 million people facing acute high food insecurity. You can see this map here on the right. So we have multiple burdens of malnutrition. Every country is affected by at least one form, and it's worsening. Another reason to transform is because zoonotic pandemics are not going anywhere. COVID is likely a zoonotic disease due to a spillover event that jumped from animals to humans. This is important from a food and agriculture perspective because agriculture extensification is into natural and wild habitats where some of these wild animals live are being destroyed or shrunken. And that is putting these animals and us and domestic animals at risk for potential zoonotic spillover events. When we look at emerging infectious diseases, 60% are zoonotic, 70% originate from wildlife. So we need to be thinking about how we manage landscapes. And last, food systems are vulnerable to increased risk of multiple breadbasket failures due to shocks, be it climate and weather, be it geopolitical or mismanagement and policy changes. And what this shows is across 4 major areas of crops, livestock, fisheries, and aquaculture, you can see the shock frequencies that these commodities face. And on the bottom is showing you the frequency of these shocks shown in red. And we're seeing more shocks, more frequency of higher volatility across these commodities. And so what we're left with are these significant concerns. Right now, we're dealing with what's called the 3 Cs: climate change, COVID, and conflict, particularly the Ukraine-Russia conflict, wreaking havoc across global food supply chains. And this is having impacts on 5 Fs: the food, fodder, finance, fertilizer, and fuel. These are a nexus of conundrums that we face that are significantly impacting these different outcomes, most acutely food security and livelihoods. So what about climate and diets? What's the relationship? Well, I think I don't need to convince anyone in this group. We are in the middle of catastrophic climate breakdown. We are in the Anthropocene, where humans are having the biggest footprint on the planet. And you can see a range of these different indicators, be it carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, these are the greenhouse gases, surface temperature, ocean acidification, forest loss, you name it, biosphere degradation. These are going in the wrong direction. And the pace of change over the last several decades is quite alarming. And a lot of that has to do with us. Our population's growing, we're using a lot of energy, a lot of water, transportation, damming up waterways, and this is significantly impacting Earth system processes and all of the different impacts that climate change is bearing. And we need to act. We keep hearing this every year at the COP meetings, the Conference of Parties, climate change meetings, as well as every time an IPCC report comes out every 5 years, showing that the window of opportunity is closing and 1.5 degree goals are largely closed now, unless something very dramatic, earth-shattering happens politically. So we need to be looking at different scenarios, but that window is closing and it's closing fast. And of course, the youth around the world have been arguing for this shutting of the window and the need to act in the immediate term. And we know that tipping points are not that far off. You look at some of these global warming thresholds in which you see things like rainforest diebacks, glacier loss, ice sheet collapse, permaculture, permafrosts collapsing. These are very scary terms, but they're very real from the models in that a significantly warmer planet will trigger these multiple climate tipping points, which will significantly impact food systems. Climate change is and will continue to have impacts on crop yields, but also the types of crops that can be grown and where. We will potentially see a lot of shifting of commodities. It might be difficult to grow wine in Italy and France, and there's shifting of the wine industry to places like England. We're already seeing that. We know that some of the major crop commodities like maize, wheat, and rice will be difficult to grow in some of the southern hemisphere, and there'll be a shifting again. with the exception of wheat, production can expand into warming regions. Rice is going to be significantly impacted in places like Africa and some parts of Asia. So we're seeing impacts on yields of crops all over the world now and into the future, and there'll need to be hard decisions made about where to grow food. We're also seeing the impacts of climate change on the nutritional quality of crops. There's a lot of people doing different work on understanding in a CO2 fertilization effect, where you have more CO2 in the atmosphere, what happens to the nutritional quality of crops. And this is some summary data showing across the world declines in iron, declines in zinc across a variety of crops, and where that is affected. But we also know that land-based mitigation efforts could have potentially benefits, but also some trade-offs. This is work showing from Hasegawa in Nature Climate Change that land-based mitigation efforts can also lead to food price increases across the world, and potentially increasing food insecurity. That's a shift away from food crops to, for example, biofuels. Could be considered a mitigation policy decision, but has implications on food security. So this shift from biofuels to away from food crops has implications. And we know that this increased food insecurity can lead to social unrest, can lead to migration of populations to cooler areas, or places where you can grow food, or places where you can't afford food. And we're seeing this migration already, with estimates of hundreds of millions of people migrating to move out of very hot places, intolerably hot places in the world. And we know that with food price increases, there's a lot of social unrest. This graph at the top is showing the food price increases of the other two food price increases we've seen in the last couple of years, in 2008, 2009, and then 2010, 2011. And this green bars are showing you the food-related protests and riots. So there's a correlation between food price increases and social unrest. And of course, the migration will ensue. Food systems are also contributing to climate change. So climate change is obviously impacting food security, diets, but food systems too are contributing to climate change and environmental degradation. We know that when we look at the entire food system, it's contributing somewhere between 25 to 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. So it's ironic that the COP has largely ignored food up to date. Food systems are also contributing to the decline of freshwater resources. We're seeing declines in marine fish stocks, as well as biodiversity being threatened around the world, both animal and plant species. But 6 economies emit half of the world's food system greenhouse gases. Here you can see China, Brazil, US, India, Indonesia, and the EU. So there are some countries that need to take much bigger action to mitigate climate change across their food systems than other countries. We also know that diets matter. The type of diet you consume emits certain amount of greenhouse gases, along with other environmental degradation like water use and land use and eutrophication. And this is work by Brett Kim at the Center for Livable Future at Hopkins, showing the impacts of different diets in the United States, typical being your omnivorous diet here. You can see here at the end, a vegan diet and the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. So the types of foods and the types of diets that people choose matter for climate change and environmental degradation. So what are some of the ethical conundrums that cloud and make transformation of food systems very challenging in the current geopolitical ecosystem? Well, one is who suffers the consequences of the world's dietary choices? We know that there's massive inequities, not only in the types of diets that people can get access to and the options that they have on hand, but the impacts on their human health and their nutrition outcomes. This is data from FAO's SOFI, the State of Food Insecurity report this year, showing who is impacted by some of the major nutrition outcomes by wealth quintiles, with yellow being low-income countries, this light blue being lower middle, and then the darker color blues being upper middle and high. And you can see that low and middle income countries are significantly disproportionately impacted by undernutrition and low birth weight. So this is just a startling contrast of inequity, where you start to see more of a balance with low and low middle income countries being almost just as affected is overweight and obesity. Of course, you see more obesity in high income countries, but low and middle income countries are catching up. So there's real inequities in when we look at nutrition and health outcomes and the kinds of diets that people are able to access. And when we think about the meat conundrum, when it comes time to climate change, we know that energy intensive lifestyles, energy intensive dietary choices of those living in high income countries, they're significant anthropogenic contributors to climate change. And those diet choices disproportionately burden those who cannot afford those animal source foods. So just look at the difference in the consumption. This is supply data showing different animal source foods. Here's the United States up at the top, and below are Cambodia, Senegal, and Ethiopia. The diet, the animal source food supply, just significant inequities on who gets access to animal source foods, which can be costly for many living in low income countries with insufficiencies in supply chains. Another ethical conundrum that's been discussed for 50 plus years, it's the post-scarcity hypothesis of what kind of food should we be grown that is ethically permissible when we have people who are going hungry. If we've got finite resources like land, like water, what should those landscapes that are producing food look like? And this is just a very macro graph from our world and data, from FAO data underlying that around of the habitable land, 50% roughly is being used for agriculture. But of that, 77% is used for raising livestock and growing the feed to feed that livestock. Whereas 23% of that land is being used for other crops. But that 77% is only contributing 18% of the global calorie supply and 37% of the global protein supply, where plant-based foods are contributing much more. So the question is, if these are so intensive, but they're not contributing significantly to the calories and protein supply, is this the best use of finite resources like our land? And this is the same argument, as I said earlier, as Francis Moore Lappé had argued 50 plus years ago, and we're still debating it and still haven't quite figured it out, and policy decisions haven't moved in a different direction than what she proposed 50 years ago. The Eat Lancet showed what food production systems would look like if the world were to eat an Eat Lancet diet. So blue is showing you in 2050, business as usual, everyone continues on the same path we're on, what food production would need to look like. And that's showing you across the different commodities. The orange is showing you if everyone were to eat the Eat Lancet diet, very plant-dominant diet, and we cut food waste in half, look at the shift in how our agriculture system would look. We'd have to increase vegetables and fruits significantly, just as we do in the business as usual. But the interesting thing is red meat would significantly come down, contraction of the livestock sector. We'd need to increase our fish, that would probably come from aquaculture, and legumes and nuts. So the agriculture system, if the world were to eat the Eat Lancet diet, would look very different. And the question is, how would we get there politically, economically, environmentally, technology-wise? The other ethical conundrum is who shapes and governs food systems. This is such a vexing issue. We know that governments are often not in control of their food systems. There's massive concentration and consolidation of the players across food systems, be it in the agrochemical, seeds, fertilizer companies, as well as within the middle part of the value chain, the commodity traders, the processors, the slaughterhouses, the retailers. We see this massive consolidation of these supply chains, and this power asymmetry causes significant issues for being able to govern food systems that promote human health, that promote environmental sustainability, and create equitable and fair livelihoods. And we see the massive proliferation of transnational companies everywhere. It's not just the United States. It's in low income, rural, deeply rural African areas, across Latin America, across Asia. We see this infiltration of transnational companies and their footprint on diets. So how do we ensure inclusive diets within planetary boundaries? And this is the last part of my talk, and I'll propose 8 things. I'm a researcher. I'm not so comfortable coming up with solutions. I'm better at describing the world around me. But these are some things that I think are interesting solutions, but need to be sorted out from a contextualized basis. There's not a one size fits all. There's not 3 game changers. There's not 2 big things you should invest in. It's a whole range of different tools and different skills needed to really transform food systems. And I'd like to start with this quote by Joan Didion, the author who just passed away this past year. I think many of you know her. She wrote a story called Goodbye to All That, where she was leaving New York and moving to Los Angeles and leaving behind her life in New York. And the story starts off with, it's easy to see the beginnings of things and harder to see the ends. And that's how I feel a bit about food system transformation. We know what we need to do. We can see the picture, but what decisions are taken, it's very hard to understand and see through the looking glass of what that will look like. Where will we end up? And that's the big question. So one of the things we need to do is, there's been a lot of political momentum. We've had the Food System Summit, we've got the COPs, we've got decades that the United Nations proclaims, Decade of Action on Nutrition, the Decade of Family Farming. There's lots of food on the political agenda. And there's been moments in time, but how do we make these moments last? How do we make them meaningful? How do we sustain the energy in a very short-visioned, very distracted political climate? A second thing I think we need to focus on is we need to get over our staple fetish. We need to diversify the supply. Maybe that means through subsidies. Maybe that means through better investments in smallholder farmers. But we are heavily reliant on a handful of crops, really rice, maize, wheat, some oils, sugar. This is not the kind of diet we want the world to consume, and it certainly has not helped us. The Ukraine-Russia crisis, 2 of the biggest producers of wheat in the world, have completely upended the global food system because we are too heavily reliant on a couple of countries to feed the world with a couple of staples. And we've seen a massive decline in local varieties of crops over the years. This is showing you Asia and Africa that produced a lot of varieties of crops historically, again, back 50 years ago in the 70s. And now most of the land growing food is using modern varieties of only a handful of crops, putting us at climate and nutritional risk. I wrote a paper during an op-ed in the Washington Post about the world being too dependent on wheat. This is not a new story. Many people have written about this over decades, but the Ukraine-Russia crisis has really highlighted this issue of our dependence on a handful of crops. Some of the work we've been doing in India by a few of us, Suparna Ghosh Jarath, Shauna Downs, Ruth DeFries, Narasimha Rao, and others, we've been doing a lot of work to try to understand traditional foods. And it's required a lot of ground truthing and deep diving into how Indigenous peoples use their traditional foods, what it means for them seasonally. And this is about 7 years of work of really understanding the importance of traditional and Indigenous foods among Indigenous communities in India. And I think we need to do more of this kind of work with Indigenous communities, of highlighting the stories, highlighting their Indigenous foods. And I know we have Barbara Burlingame, who's going to speak later, who was a champion of this work when she was at FAO and continues to do so and has done a lot of work in this space with colleagues. I think blue foods need higher priority. We often forget about them when we're talking about crops. We're talking about animal source foods. Blue foods is hardly mentioned. Something called the Blue Food Assessment came out this past year, showing the importance of blue foods from a nutrient diversity perspective. My favorite, bivalves, small fish, sardines, very nutrient rich. But blue foods, of course, are under climate threats, whether it's heat extremes, ocean acidification, sea level rising, loss of sea ice, pests and pathogens. We need to be thinking about protecting these blue foods that may become incredibly critical as raising large beasts like cattle might become incredibly challenging in a very hot world. So one of the things I think we need to do is provide adaptation support and tools for food system actors. Estimates suggest 4.5 billion people work in food systems, informally and formally, full-time to very part-time. We know that small farms produce more than 75% of the food in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and they produce a lot of the nutrients that are injected into the food supply. That's work by Mario Herrero and colleagues. So we need to provide innovative tools and information to help them adapt so they can produce nutritious foods and get them to markets and places where these foods can be grown. Many places where smallholder farmers are, you can grow a lot of horticulture. For the large scale actors, we need to incentivize them to produce nutritious, sustainable, cheap, and convenient foods. Maybe some of that is regulation. We need to invigorate youth to work and invest in food systems, make it attractive for them. Right now, farming's drudgery. How do we get more youth engaged, like the counterculture movement I mentioned? The Back to the Landers did that. And learn also from elders who've been working in food systems for a long time. How do we bring these communities together? Another area is promoting stronger governance of food environments, the places where people shop for food. So to ensure that they can get better access to healthy foods and information. Things like regulating that space, taxes on sugar sweetened beverages and other junk foods. Other ideas of bringing in food-based dietary guidelines. Anna Herforth's done work on this. 90 countries have a food-based dietary guidelines from a paper of hers. 85 countries have a school meal program, public procurement. So we need to find ways to increase food access to diverse and nutritious foods at local levels, along with public institutions like school meal programs. We need to introduce regulations to incentivize sustainable food choices, lowering prices, and disincentivizing unhealthy and unsustainable foods through taxation. And support policy measures and awareness programs to help communities and consumers better understand what is healthy, what is sustainable. It's a very confusing space for people. The food environment, the choice architecture within food environments is an incredible space to make great change. It's localized. You can make changes that directly impact people who are walking into shops, markets, and restaurants every day. This is the place to intervene. And there's a lot of work being done on to better understand food environments and drivers of dietary choice. Some work that we did with Michael Clark, I found this to be a really incredible study where he estimated the environmental impacts and the health impacts of 57,000 food products in the UK. And this graphic is showing you, these plots are showing you different food products that are grouped into categories, showing you their environment and nutrition benefits from low environmental impact to high environmental impact, low nutrition to high nutrition. This could then inform labeling. It helps consumers better understand not only is the food healthy, but is it environmentally sustainable across things like water, greenhouse gases, eutrophication, and land use. So this is a first step in really classifying each food product and whether or not it's meeting both health and environment goals. And I really encourage you to read this paper. It was a labor of love of Michael Clark. But we need to nudge the demand. When you look at this graph, this is from the Human Development Report in 2020, the green is showing you the percentage of people who are likely to do something versus red is unlikely to do something. And if you look here at the bottom, eating less meat or eating fewer dairy products and replacing those with alternatives. Not great here, right? More people are less likely to make these shifts. Now, is that changing? Perhaps. But how do we nudge people to move towards these foods? Of course, price, taste, and convenience is going to be key. This is an interesting paper showing you that if we replace global beef consumption with microbial proteins like corn, which is a fungus-based protein alternative, you can reduce deforestation and carbon emissions. But is this evidence enough to nudge consumers? We did another study led by Daniel Masson de Croats showing that if we start to move away in the United States from beef to alternative proteins, a 10% substitution of alternative proteins, a 30% and a 60% substitute away from beef to these alt proteins, it has significant impacts on the livestock sector and the beef processing sector. It's probably a loss of about 1 million or so jobs in the United States alone. But there's gains across other animal sectors as well as gains across plant-based sectors. So it's really interesting to look at some of the ethical and economic trade-offs if the world, and this is, in this case, the United States, were to start shifting towards plant-based beef substitutes. And we know that alternative proteins are an emerging area. You know, it's a little bit of the Joan Didion of where will it end? We don't know. But one thing that's certain is that if the price isn't right, this is an interesting study by Boston Consulting Group and Blue Horizon showing that 0% of consumers are willing to pay a price premium for these alt proteins. And that's pretty clear. So the price needs to be right. And of course, the taste and convenience needs to be there too. A study we'd done in the United States, surveying people from Nebraska and California, we asked them to cluster a group of foods. This was about 45 foods. And we didn't tell them how to cluster or sort these foods. We didn't say by food group or by nutritional quality, by environment. We just asked them to cluster them of what makes sense. And these are the foods and how they cluster them. And this is a bit of an easier look. And interestingly, it was hard for these groups in the US to cluster plant-based milk, Impossible Burger, and Vitro Burger, and instant ramen noodles, and pizza. They couldn't cluster them into what they typically clustered these groups into, which was the food groups, meats, dairy, grains. They couldn't do it. So it shows that a lot of people don't quite understand what these foods are in some places. Things to be thinking about from a research perspective. My last two slides, we need to ensure that evidence and data help policymakers make informed decisions. We have something called the Food Systems Dashboard we launched in 2020, which is a curated set of high quality indicators that are displayed in visually appealing ways and easy for policymakers to see how their food systems are characterized and performing. We also have started something called the Food Systems Countdown Initiative, which is a science-based observational system to track global food systems and their changes over the next 10 years. And we'll be publishing the baseline report of that in early 2023. So keep your eye out for that. One of the interesting things we did on the dashboard, and we'll incorporate methods around this for the countdown, is we set thresholds to about 40 indicators across food systems and allowed for people to look at these indicators and say, where is their challenges across food supplies and food environments and nutrition and environment outcomes, and where are those challenge areas and where are they doing well? So here's just showing you here at the bottom, high income countries. These set square is environmental indicators of food systems, environmental outcomes. High income countries aren't doing so well there, as compared to up here on the top on the upper right quadrant, low income countries. So it gives you a snapshot of how food systems are performing. This really helps policymakers in making decisions on how to intervene across their food systems. And last, we can't give up on research and evidence. I think many people joining this call are researchers. And I think we are at a time when facts and evidence are under incredible scrutiny, sometimes openly disregarded as suspect or trolled, as we are seeing even more on Twitter, by different groups, including political and business leaders. But we need to continue, we need to press on, because research has a vital role in charting a positive path for global food security, nutrition, and health. And research can and does bring wholesale changes in attitudes, political thought, and action. We have so many examples of research informing and completely changing policy in positive directions. And look at the climate change agenda that's been going strong for 40 years of research, and now policymakers are listening. So we can chart a positive path, and I encourage you to keep doing research and garnering and building the evidence that is so vital for positive, sustainable development in the world. And last, we need to deal with the political environment of food systems. We have a lot of fracturing and disagreement. Who should do that is unclear, but one way of doing that is building from the ground up, cultivating movements, coalitions, and networks, and hold our governments, hold the private sector, hold those to account, and keep pushing from the bottom up, and ensuring that the top is listening. And the only way to do that is through a concerted global effort and a new counterculture movement for food and environment that's a global one, to ensure that we can ensure that our governments are behaving in the ways that we think will benefit human society.